To say, I didn't realize University.
Oh,
I didn't realize that University of Strathclyde looks so much like Dowistock.
yeah. No, I thought, seeing as I can't be there in person, I thought I could at least look at some pictures of it.
Well, it is a nice place. I remember when I got there the first time, I was very pleasantly surprised by how nice it is.
Yeah, and the countryside's supposed to be really beautiful around it as well, I've heard.
It is indeed. It is indeed. And what is more, it's also interesting place to do research for somebody like me, because it's right on the religious borderland between Catholics and Orthodox. So,
oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah,
that's super interesting.
Yeah, it's the one and only part of Poland where there is a very large Orthodox community.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, and is the food good as well?
The food, I gotta say, I mean, of course, you can find good food, but there is this thing about potatoes being a really, really major part of the traditional food in that region. Certainly more of a thing than I would favor. I like potatoes, not that much.
Fair enough. Yeah, I was very impressed with the food when I was in Krakow. Last time I was at one of these meetings in person. I thought the food was amazing. I think I just, yeah, had really nice places to eat.
Yeah, well, Krakow and Białystok are really quite different from each other.
Okay.
All right.
Can you see the slides?
Yes, we can definitely see the slides. All right, everyone, it's now 1:30. So it is time for us to be starting up again after the lunch break. We have with us Professor Benedict Jones from the University of Strathclyde, and he will be telling us today about the title's changed. How does mating psychology change over the menstrual cycle? So it's not just women you'll be talking about. You'll be talking about men also.
I will just be talking about women. Well, men as stimuli, men as objects. But,
men as objects, and rightly so.
Quite right. Maybe not me though. But yeah, so today I'm going to be talking about really how does women's mating psychology change over the menstrual cycle. And I'm going to be particularly focusing in the sort of first part of the talk on which of the different theories about how women's mating psychology changes as a function of conception risk really kind of most accurately characterizes these cyclic changes in behaviors and cognitions. And in the second part of the talk, or towards the end of the talk, I'm going to be talking a little bit about what I see as some of the key directions for future research in this sort of research topic and area. And it's a little bit different to the type of talk that I normally give. Normally when I give talks, especially on this topic, I tend to do a sort of deep dive and dig into the sort of nitty gritty of a relatively small number of papers, usually my own work. What I'm going to be doing today is a little bit different. I'm going to try and give a bit of a overview, if you like, of recent developments in the field. It's a topic where research has really banged along at quite a pace over the last sort of few years in particular, and really try and give you that kind of overview about what I think is sort of happening with our thinking about this topic. And I've put the slides up on the OSF there. The talk's really a kind of extension of a text paper I published with Amanda Hahn and Lisa DeBryan a couple of years ago. But like I said, the research area has really developed and moved quite quickly since this paper came out. So it's really kind of quite a few sort of updates and sort of new things to think about and new findings to think about that have come out subsequently. But if you're zoning in and out of this kind of Zoom talk, then and you're wanting to get an overview of what I sort of generally think about this topic, this would be a sort of good place to start. And there's an open access version of it up on SciArchive if you're struggling to get hold of the paper. Okay, so unarguably, the sort of dominant theory that's guided research on cyclic changes in women's mating psychology is the dual mating strategy hypothesis. And if you're looking for a sort of deep discussion of some of the key predictions that come out of this and some of the fundamental assumptions and the rationale for this hypothesis, a really good place to start would be Steve Ganjestad and Randy Thornhill's Human Estrus paper in Proceedings of the Royal Society of London. Really what the dual mating strategy hypothesis predicts is that women will show increased interest in extra-pair sex, with men displaying putative cues of good genes for immunocompetence when conception risk is high. And I've put putative there because I've become increasingly skeptical of the existence of physical cues of good genes for immunocompetence. And that's an issue I'm going to return to towards the end of my talk. But really, the dual mating strategy hypothesis is making two related but dissociable predictions or key predictions. And that's that women will show increased interest in extra-pair sex around ovulation or during the ovulatory high fertility phase of the menstrual cycle. And that women will also show increased attraction to men displaying these putative good genes for immunocompetence. But really, the its most sort of fundamental level, what the dual mating strategy hypothesis is really arguing is that the benefits of cuckoldry have been a critical selection pressure for the evolution of cyclic shifts in women's mating psychology. In other words, what it's arguing is that women can maximize the benefits of their mate choices by forming long-term relationships with kind of caring, sharing guys who'll father the kids of these guys who display with good genes for immunocompetence. And what really kind of popularized the dual mating strategy hypothesis was a series of really high-profile papers, like the one on the left there by Ian Pentonville and Dave Perrett in Nature, showing cyclic changes in women's preferences for facial masculinity, arguably or probably the most kind of widely studied putative cue of good genes for immunocompetence. And then a series of papers from Marty Hazelton's group reporting increased interest in extra-pair mating during the ovulatory phase of the menstrual cycle. And interest in extra-pair mating was operationalized in lots of different ways across the studies. Quite a lot of converging evidence for that idea. And since, hang on. I can't advance. My screen's frozen.
It's quite possibly that you're not on the presentation. The presentation is somehow sort of in the background rather than. Oh no, we've actually lost Ben.
Perhaps his battery died.
Oh dear. Ola, please keep an eye on the waiting room, because if Ben ends up in the waiting room, we don't want him sitting there.
Yeah, of course, but the waiting room is off, so.
Okay.
Joining
So
directly to the room.
All right. Here he is. He's coming back.
Yeah.
I just everything froze there.
Okay, glad to have you back.
Apologies for this.
And we're back.
Yep. And since these, studies by the likes of Ian Pentonville, Marty Hazelton came out in the sort of late 90s and throughout the 2000s, there's been a bunch of other studies that have all reported clear evidence, in inverted commas, for the dual mating strategy hypothesis. So this is work by people like David Putz and David Feinberg, showing cyclic shifts in women's voice preferences. Work by Steve Gangestad, showing cyclic shifts in women's preferences for male displays of dominance, and work that I did with Tony Little at Bath University, showing cyclic shifts in women's face preferences. So if you look at this kind of work around 2010, this body of research, you get the strong impression that there's very clear evidence for the dual mating strategy hypothesis. It's done it again.
This is rather unfortunate. We've lost him again.
It seems like when he tries to progress a slide, it freezes everything. I wonder, Conrad, if you can present the slides for him.
This is evidence why you shouldn't get a Mac and stick with it. You should stick with a PC.
That's a hypothesis, yes. Ben, I can see you back. Perhaps you could send me the slides and I could control the slides or something like that, so we could avoid the issue. What do you think? Ben?
I'll try doing it like this and see if it's making it full screen. That's the problem.
Ah, yes. Okay, great.
Okay.
Let's do it that way.
So basically around 2010, a number of problems started to emerge with this big literature purporting to show clear evidence for the dual mating strategy hypothesis. The first of these big problems was that null results began appearing in the literature from around 2010 onwards. This is work by people like Isabel Scott, Brendan Zeech, Christine Harris. I think most researchers, including myself, found it really quite easy to sort of swat away, if you like, or dismiss these null results, principally because they came from studies using between subject designs. And these between subject design studies are arguably really quite poorly equipped to detect what are presumably quite subtle within women changes in mating psychology. But nonetheless, they give researchers pause for thought. There are also a bunch of methodological limitations that people started pointing to in the literature. People like Steve Gangestad, Candice Blake, and also Ulla Marcinkowska. People began to point out that the sample sizes typically used in the studies were relatively small, and that the self-report diary methods that were used to assess position in the menstrual cycle and assess conception risk were noisy and imprecise. And both of these issues, kind of imprecise measurement and small sample sizes, cause low power. So it's possible that what we're seeing is a combination of low-powered studies, publication bias in the literature, and a high false positive rate, basically. But the problems that were being raised with and the criticisms that were being made of the dual mating strategy hypothesis weren't specific to these null results and methodological issues. There were also a lot of theoretical challenges that researchers highlighted that kind of undermine some of the fundamental assumptions that the dual mating strategy hypothesis makes or sort of has at its core. One of the core assumptions of the dual mating strategy hypothesis is that there's a benefit in terms of reproductive fitness to the offspring of masculine men. While Anthony Lee actually presented really quite clear evidence that there might actually, that might not necessarily be the case. There might actually be substantial costs to the daughters in particular of masculine men. Masculine men tend to have masculine daughters who are relatively unattractive, and those women could incur a potentially substantial cost to their reproductive fitness. One of the other fundamental assumptions underpinning much of the thinking in the dual mating strategy hypothesis is this idea of cuckoldry being a selection pressure on women's mating psychology. Research, and this is a really, really nice review article on this topic in Tree that I'd really recommend reading, improved sort of genetic studies, the improved methods in genetic studies actually caused researchers to revise their estimates of the rate of cuckoldry in ancestral humans, and actually suggest that the cuckoldry rates in ancestral humans were relatively low. And it's difficult to see how these very low rates of cuckoldry in ancestral societies could have been the sort of strong selection pressure that designed these quite sophisticated, subtle changes in women's mating psychology. So when those are the kind of the sort of problems that the research area was facing, what are the kind of solutions? Well, the obvious solution is to do more research and conduct large-scale studies that address particularly the methodological limitations of the previous research. And that's what I did in a series of studies over a 5-year period funded by the ERC and also a grant from the ESRC, one of the UK funding bodies. And what we did was test just under 600 women up to 15 times. So women came in once a week for up to 15 weekly test sessions. The table there just shows you how many women completed how many test sessions. So only 18 women stuck with us for the full 15 weeks. 26 women got sick of us after one test session and dropped out. 508 women did 5 weekly test sessions, 184 women did 10 weekly test sessions, etc. So you can already kind of see that this study is on a much larger scale than the previous within subject studies that typically tested 20, 30, maybe 40 women. And in each of the test sessions, women provided a saliva sample and completed a kind of standard facial masculinity preference test, just exactly the same as those that had been used in previous research. What we found was no significant within subject effects of estradiol, progesterone, estradiol and progesterone interacting, the ratio of estradiol to progesterone, testosterone, cortisol, or the interaction between testosterone or cortisol. So in other words, we're not really seeing any evidence for cyclic changes in women's masculinity preferences. We published these findings in 2018 in Psychological Science. And we also found no either between or within subject effects of oral contraceptive use that would be consistent with the dual mating strategy hypothesis. So here we're failing to replicate, or we're not replicating many of the key studies, including my own findings, that masculinity preferences track changes in women's hormonal status. So we're not really finding any evidence here for the dual mating strategies hypothesis that mate preferences change as a function of changes in hormonal status over the menstrual cycle. I'm focusing on masculinity here, and the paper really focused on masculinity, but we also looked at other putative facial cues to immunocompetence, things like symmetry, and saw exactly the same pattern of null results. So that's one of the kind of key predictions that comes out of the dual mating strategy hypothesis, this idea that mate preferences change over the menstrual cycle. We're not seeing any evidence for it here. What about the other prediction? Well, on exactly the same sample of women and using exactly the same sort of design, we also tested for a change in women's openness or desire for uncommitted sexual relationships. So in each test session, we gave women, the participants, 2 questionnaires, one assessing sort of general sexual desire, just an interest in sexual activity in general, and another questionnaire, the socio-sexual orientation inventory, the revised version, that specifically assesses desire for uncommitted sexual relationships. And what we found was that general sexual desire, just a general interest in sexual activity, increased when estradiol was high and decreased when progesterone was high, suggesting, and that's consistent with the very widely reported finding, that there's a general increase in sexual desire during the ovulatory phase of the menstrual cycle. But we found no evidence that interest or desire for uncommitted sexual relationships track changes in women's hormonal status. And around about the same time as we published this paper in Psychoneuroendocrinology, a bunch of other researchers published very similar results. The Van Steen paper there, or Van Steen, sorry, my pronunciation of names is terrible. It's basically a direct replication of our study. It uses exactly the same 2 questionnaires and finds exactly the same pattern of results: a general increase in interest in sexual desire, an increase in general sexual desire during the ovulatory phase of the menstrual cycle, but no cyclic change in responses on the socio-sexual orientation inventory. Jim Roney and Rob Barton's group at Durham published very similar patterns of results, just a general increase in sexual desire during the ovulatory phase. And a very large scale online study by Ruben Arslan. It's an online study, but it is longitudinal. Also found no evidence for an increase in extra-pair sexual desire, specifically around ovulation. So what we're really kind of seeing here again is very little evidence for the second prediction that comes out of the dual mating strategy hypothesis, this idea that women will be more open to uncommitted sexual relationships or extra-pair sex during the ovulatory phase of the menstrual cycle. Since we did that work, a bunch of studies have come out, either some subsequently, some around about the same time. Series of pre-registered studies by Stern and colleagues at University of Göttingen, and Julia Stern's just recently moved to University of Bremen. Also found little evidence for increased attraction to men displaying putative cues of immunocompetence when conception risk was high. They looked, and they found this pattern of results, that is no change in masculinity preferences, when they looked at women's preferences for male bodies, male voices, and also male behavioral displays of dominance and assertiveness. So in other words, this is, again, not really straightforwardly supporting the dual mating strategy hypothesis. And in fact, they're failing to replicate many of the key findings for vocal masculinity preferences, body masculinity preferences, and behavioral displays that are really widely cited as evidence for the dual mating strategy hypothesis. Their work really suggests that those findings aren't as robust as we once thought. Similarly, a series of studies by Ula Marcinkowska and colleagues in Poland also showed little evidence for increased attraction to men displaying putative cues of immunocompetence during the ovulatory phase of the menstrual cycle. They found no changes in preferences for men's facial masculinity, facial symmetry, or body masculinity. They did, however, find some evidence for an increase in openness to uncommitted sexual relationships during the ovulatory phase of the menstrual cycle in a recent paper in Evolution in Human Behavior. That is in line with one of the key predictions from the dual mating strategy hypothesis. It's inconsistent with some of the null results I've spoken about so far. That's an issue I'm going to return to a little bit later in my talk. Okay, so what do these results really mean? Well, I think what they really mean is that we're not seeing the kind of robust evidence from the dual mating strategy hypothesis that you would anticipate seeing, given the findings that were reported in the sort of late 90s and throughout the early 2000s. Specifically, we're seeing very little evidence consistent with the idea that women show increased interest in extra-pair sex, with men displaying putative cues of good genes for immunocompetence when conception risk is high. And in fact, a lot of the early studies or early findings that were put forward as evidence for that don't seem to be robust and don't seem to replicate in much larger samples with improved methodologies. Instead, I would argue, and this is an idea and a theoretical framework that was really developed by Jim Roney, and I'm just really jumping on that bandwagon. It fits. I agree with Jim that it's a really, really nice way of accommodating the positive findings and the null results that have been reported in the recent literature. And it's also kind of outlined in my 2019 text paper. What this motivational priorities hypothesis really predicts is that you'll see an increase in general sexual desire and attraction to men in general when conception risk is high. And that's exactly what we're seeing in a lot of the work, an increase in general sexual desire rather than specific increases in desire for extra-pair sex. And a lot of Julia Stern's work in particular has shown that women, although their masculinity preferences don't increase during the ovulatory phase of the menstrual cycle, their attraction to men in general does seem to increase. And this sort of fits with this idea of a general increase in sexual desire. What Jim's argued is that the benefits of allocating greater resources to sex when conception risk is high has been really the critical selection pressure for the evolution of cyclic shifts in women's mating psychology. In other words, how women trade off the costs and benefits of allocating resources like time and effort to seeking sex and pursuing sex during the ovulatory phase of the menstrual cycle is different at points of sort of low fertility. And Jim's recently done some really nice work assessing this trade-off in effort by looking at interest in sex versus interest in food and food intake. And it fits very nicely, the results fit very nicely with this mating motivational priorities hypothesis. Okay, so where do we go now? Well, I just want, these aren't necessarily what everyone would agree are important future directions. These are really just issues that I'm particularly interested in and that I think are important. I think the first issue that I'm interested in looking at next is really an empirical one. And this is do scores on subscales of the socio-sexual orientation inventory change as a function of steroid hormones or conception risk. And the reason for looking at this is that there's 3 studies that have looked at changes in desire for uncommitted sexual relationships using this specific instrument, the socio-sexual orientation inventory. 2 of them found no evidence that responses on that scale changed over the cycle. But Ulla's recent paper has really given me pause for thought and made me think that, well, you know, maybe we jumped the gun on this, and maybe there are findings that are there that we missed in these previous studies. So that's a part of the literature I'm quite interested in sort of tidying up. This kind of inconsistent results for socio-sexual orientation inventory. I'm also interested in looking at the question of whether cyclic shifts are robustly moderated by between women factors. So this is kind of between women differences in things like commitment to their relationship or partner attractiveness. People like Christine Larson, Marty Hazelton have done some really nice work looking at this in terms of changes in extra-pair sexual desire, finding that women who are relatively uncommitted to their relationships or who have relatively unattractive partners are those who show the largest cyclic shifts in extra-pair sexual desire. There's been very little research done looking at these kind of moderators in terms of cyclic changes in women's mate preferences, and that's something that I'm interested to sort of address. The kind of fly in the ointment or the difficulty with this type of research is really nicely articulated by Candice Blake and Steve Gangestad in this recent paper in SPVB, a social psychology journal, where they really demonstrate very clearly just how large a sample size you need to be able to be adequately powered to detect these kind of high level interactions, these kind of moderator effects. It's clear that we're going to need much bigger sample sizes to properly look at this issue than we do even in recent work. And I think getting the funding to do that type of research is obviously going to be a sort of challenge for the field going forward. The research area has done an awful lot to improve measurement, particularly around methods for estimating hormonal status and conception risk, although I have to say I'm developing some concerns about the use of salivary hormone levels for this type of work, which is the main method I've used myself. But I think there's also improvements that we can make around measurement, and particularly in the methods that we use for assessing mate preferences. Researchers typically, when assessing mate preferences in this area, use the 2 alternative forced choice method. It's taken from psychophysics. It's just where you show two faces, for example, a masculinized and a feminized one, and simply ask participants to indicate which face is the more attractive. A bunch of people have recently pointed to some criticisms or some problems or potential problems with this method. For example, some people have argued that it's better presenting, it's more tapping individual differences or variation or changes in face matching and face discrimination skills, rather than individual differences in preferences specifically. And a really nice paper by Alex Jones and Bastian Jaeger has shown that the two alternative forced choice method can produce patterns of preferences that are qualitatively different than those that you get with if you use paradigms where participants rate the attractiveness of individual stimuli. In the context of this talk, I think a bigger problem with the two alternative forced choice method is that it's very good for allowing you to measure preferences for a specific trait, but it doesn't allow you to assess preferences for men in general at the same time as assessing preferences for a specific trait. That makes it really difficult to test the competing predictions that come out of the dual mating strategy hypothesis on one hand and the motivational priorities hypothesis on the other. So I think a move away from two alternative forced choice methods towards paradigms where participants rate the attractiveness of individual faces will really, individual stimuli will really benefit the field. This next issue is one that I've become really very interested in recently. The cyclic shift literature has been a really good example of an area that's very quickly got on board with making analysis code and data sets open access. But if you look at areas that have had open data for longer periods of time, so some areas of physics, some areas of medical sciences like epidemiology, a really well-acknowledged problem or challenge that you face when you have these large, high-dimensional open data sets is how you assess the evidentiary value of secondary data analyses. In other words, when people come along and conduct further analyses on the open data set, how do you assess the evidentiary value of those results? And the issue is really quite a straightforward one. When you've got an open data set that lots and lots of different groups could be simultaneously running lots of different analyses on, you have exactly the same problems with controlling the false positive rate as you'd have if you've got a data set and you run lots and lots of different types of analysis on it. So I think there's a kind of open question for the area at the moment is whether we should be treating results of secondary data analyses as confirmatory, as many people are, or whether the results of these analyses should be viewed as purely exploratory until they're confirmed by outset testing or replicated in other data sets. And there was a really quite interesting discussion around this issue recently in Evolution in Human Behavior, sparked by a publication of a secondary data analysis of a Julia Stern paper on body masculinity preferences. And finally, the last issue I'm wanting to talk about is the one I sort of flagged right at the very beginning of my talk, and that's whether or not there actually do exist physical cues of immunocompetence. It's a fundamental assumption of much of the work that's done in evolutionary psychology, evolutionary biology of mate preferences. But actually, when you look at the evidence, empirical evidence for the existence of these cues, it's really quite weak. A really nice paper by Fu and colleagues came out recently in Scientific Reports, finding very little evidence, for example, of looking at a variety of different facial characteristics and a variety of objective measures of health and immunocompetence, so salivary markers of immune response, oxidative stress, things like this, finding very little evidence for associations between these health measures and immune response measures and facial characteristics. And this is a paper on the right there that I've had very recently accepted at Trends in Cognitive Sciences. I haven't posted a preprint of it, but if anyone wants a copy of it, just send us an email and I'll send them it. It's a pretty short paper, actually. But here we really make the argument that it's really time for people studying mate preferences to maybe start to move away from assuming that there's physical cues of immunocompetence and these guide mate preferences and attractiveness judgments, and start thinking about attraction and mate preferences within a slightly different framework. Okay, I'll finish up there. Sorry for the technical snafus along the way. Thanks very much for your time, and maybe I can take some questions. Cheers.
Thanks a lot for that. Questions, please.
Or am I off the hook completely?
Certainly you will not be. If nobody else has any questions, I certainly will have one. Well, I don't see any questions popping up, so I will ask mine because it's kind of, you know, it's not a very in-depth question. Let's just put it that way. At one point, you said that there's very little evidence among humans for cuckoldry, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. I mean, I'm definitely outside the field, but my impression was that the numbers that I heard somewhere, right, the way one does, it was that supposedly 1 in 10 children is brought up by a man who thinks he's their father but isn't. I take it this is not reflective of reality, yeah?
So, I mean, this is the part of the sort of research area that I know the very least about. So it's the one where I'm most guided by the people that work on directly on it, who are the sort of geneticists, and they're putting their, you know, using, rather than using, I think a lot of the sort of newspaper reports, if you like, that give impression, they're usually quite high profile stories. They're often anecdotal or at least kind of self-report. When you look at the studies that have actually used genetic analyses to estimate it, and particularly the kind of algorithms that allow them to estimate it in ancestral society, the cuckoldry rates are really very low. The exceptions seem to be in societies with arranged marriages. They seem to have higher incidents of cuckoldry, but they're driven, those higher incidents, they're still not very high, but they're higher than in the other societies. They seem to be driven almost entirely by arranged marriages. They're relatively uncommon, even in those societies where there's so-called love marriages, as opposed to arranged ones. But yes, the emerging picture in the genetic literature is really that we've been hugely overestimating cuckoldry rates in ancestral societies.
Interesting. All right, well, nobody else is putting up their hand, so I'll keep on going. I'll keep on digging, right? Oh, no, Bogusz has raised his hand, so Bogusz, please.
Yeah, I'm here. I've got one reflection and one question. I'll start with the question. Ben, I think that majority of those studies are on weird societies, Western societies, which might be a bit not, it might not reflect the conditions in our ancestors, because in these societies, for example, the sex hormones levels are higher usually than in other like traditional societies, hunter-gatherers or whatever. So the first question might be, this is something that make impossible to take any evolutionary conclusions from these Western societies. But I'm not sure what's the percentage of studies on these societies. I believe that majority. And the second reflection is like, if you imagine our ancestors in far past, so you should be aware that at that time women basically did not ovulate. So I'm a bit suspicious about dual strategy hypothesis, because they were either pregnant or lactating. So the number of ovulations they had in their lifetime was not as big as today, of course, in Western societies. And what is more, the number of potential sexual partners in small-scale societies was very restricted. And therefore, I doubt that there could be strong enough selection and lasting pretty long time to be in some way to have some kind of effect. I'm not sure whether we should expect it. So the second is kind of reflection, and I would like to hear your response to this. And the first is whether Western countries are good to test this hypothesis.
I mean, I think diversity of samples is always a good thing. It's a difficult topic to study in Western societies, but I absolutely agree that there's definitely a kind of there's definitely a gap in the market, as it were, to do this type of research on small scale societies. And I would love to. I don't have the resources or really the kind of expertise to do it myself, but I'd love to see. I'd love to collaborate with people who did and look at this issue. So that's on the sort of sample diversity weird issue. On the issue of whether or not you'd expect to see in societies where the mating pool is quite small, you'd expect to see how could, if I'm understanding your question right, how could these sort of selective mate preferences emerge if the mating pool is so small? And again, I'd agree with you there. The one point that you made that I would slightly push back on, or slightly sort of challenge, is this idea that because women were essentially either breastfeeding or pregnant a lot of the time, they were ovulation was very rare, and therefore, or unusual or atypical, and therefore, why would you expect to see these selection pressures? Why would you expect to see increased choosiness or things like this? I mean, the first point I would make is that I don't think we do see increased choosiness during the ovulatory phase, but I would be hesitant to say that because something, I guess the point I would like to make here is that if ovulation is relatively rare, then there is an argument, a counter argument to the point you made, that the importance of getting the mating decision correct, in inverted commas, choosing a good mate, is particularly important. If it doesn't happen very often and you're going to carry the costs associated with it for a long period of time, then there is a counter argument to the point that because it's rare, it's the fact that it's rare is actually a compelling reason for seeing a selection pressure that would shape that be importance. And I've had this conversation lots and lots and lots of times with lots of different anthropologists. I think it's very this idea that's very entrenched in, particularly in the anthropological sort of researchers thinking about cyclic shifts, is ovulation's rare in ancestral societies, therefore you wouldn't expect to see this. And I've never quite followed the logic of that myself. I've often thought, well, hang on, if it's rare, isn't it more important to get the decision right rather than unimportant?
Yeah, I can understand your point, of course, but if there was a patrilocality and mate guarding, so it would be very, very risky for women to follow this kind of dual strategy. This is be some kind negative selection, basically.
Yeah. No, I see where you're coming from. Yeah, could be. Kasia?
Nice to see you, Ben, virtually.
Yeah, nice to virtually see you, Kasia. Oh, and it was nice as well, Boguslav.
Nice talk. I actually just have a really simple clarification question about, you noted that women around the time of ovulation, their general sexual desire increases. How is that measured? So I understand it's measured by one of the 2 questionnaires that you employed in that study and that others have employed. And basically my question is, does this include sexual interest in all sorts of sexual behaviors, or is it specifically heterosexual preferences for women preferring sex with other men?
It's I can't remember. So I guess the first point is a really good point about the sort of direct relevance to diverse people of a lot of these kind of sexual activity questionnaires. We also had a single item questionnaire that we saw the same pattern of results for. And we borrowed it from a Jim Roney paper, which is just, it's a single item that's just, how would you rate your sexual desire on a scale of 1 to 7? And you see the pattern of results quite clearly with just that single item. The sexual desire inventory scale, sexual desire inventory, I think it's the revised version of it, is the one that we used. You can put it all together into one single compound measure of general sexual desire, or you can split it into, it has a dyadic subscale, and they call it, it's basically a scale that measures interest in masturbation. They call it the solitary desire scale. We saw very similar patterns of results for all 3 ways of looking at it. So it's not necessarily specific to engaging in heterosexual sex. It does seem to be just a general interest in sexual desire. Some other researchers, we've never done this, but some other researchers have looked at self-reported sexual activity, and that in some of the studies shows a very similar pattern of results. In other studies, it doesn't. And when you look at the studies, it seems to be to do with being able to control for things like whether or not the ovulatory phase of the menstrual cycle overlapped with a weekend or a Friday night, and also you've also whether or not the studies take into account the person's partner's sexual desire, which may or may not closely align with theirs. So yeah, I actually took out a slide just yesterday that was about trying to improve measurement of these scales for both interest in uncommitted sexual relationships and also general sexual desire. Definitely think there's a need to improve measurement there as well.
Okay, thank you. And I'm just wondering then, has anyone looked at non-survey, asked the question with more methods, how to explain? For example, there are tools in these sex labs that exist in McMaster University that measure, not self-rated sexual interest, but actually measure arousal, physiological arousal. And you find often that the physiological arousal doesn't match with what people report because of various
I mean,
obvious.
Meredith Chivers has done some work on this, and there does seem to be a cyclic change in sort of general sexual arousal or response to sort of mildly erotic images. I know of a bunch of different groups that have tried to look at for changes in those response patterns that might more closely correspond to the dual mating strategy hypothesis, like manipulating cues of immunocompetence or even just attractiveness of the men, and looking for an interaction between the effect of that and the effect of cycle phase. And I've never seen any of these studies come out. It's one of these things that when I meet people at conferences, they tell me they're looking at, but nothing seems to come out of it. For
a file drawer problem.
Potentially. And I think actually that's one of the things that Jim Roney's done a really good job of pulling together an alternative theory that can, or an alternative framework that can accommodate, still accommodate a bunch of the more robust findings. I get emails all the time from people saying, oh, we got this thing that actually fits the mating motivational priorities hypothesis, but because it didn't fit the dual mating one, we never sort of followed up writing it up or anything. And I think it's given people a bit of motivation to sort of do that, which is, I think, a good thing.
Okay, super, thank you.
Cheers.
Great. There's also a comment from Peter Jonathan. Perhaps you'd like to say something a bit more?
Sure.
Hi, Peter.
Hi, Ben. Obviously, I'm in Europe now, not in Sydney anymore. So I was thinking about this motivational shifting idea, and what I hear is that it's a life history. It's essentially a life history approach, right? Is that under this particular context, women essentially shift mildly from being more K to being a little bit more R. And I'm wondering if it has been done, or you think it's sensible to do like formal life history tests as opposed to SOI stuff, looking at, life history trade-offs, future discounting, dog triad, obviously, these kinds of tests instead. I
mean, I don't know of anybody, I've never really thought about it specifically in those sort of terms. It's a good point. In terms of life history, I have thought of it a little bit in terms of like sort of general risk taking before, and I wanted to look at future discounting using things like the Kirby task in the big study that we ran, but it was unfortunately one of the things that we were getting. It was such an investment of time. We wanted to test everything that we were interested in, and unfortunately we couldn't fit everything in the test blocks. And the Kirby task was one of the ones that got pulled out, unfortunately. I'm sure there is a literature though on, I mean, there's I guess the closest thing I can think of off the top of my head to the type of thing you're describing is changes in kind of reward sensitivity over the menstrual cycle. So there's a lot of evidence that, cocaine is particularly rewarding during the ovulatory phase of the menstrual cycle. I think it's generally pretty rewarding, but particularly then. And also evidence looking specifically at the sort of neurals from studies look specifically at neural substrates, the actual reward centers like the nucleus accumbens, and to identical financial rewards, they fire particularly strong during the ovulatory phase of the menstrual cycle. And I've published one paper where we use the sort of key press task that's often used to measure reward sensitivity. We found kind of mixed evidence for that the reward value of masculine men went up there, but we found a really strong effect of women were more motivated to look at men and were willing to expend more effort to look at male faces, which is hard to believe, during the ovulatory phase of the menstrual cycle. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see if people have, it'd be interesting to see a study where people administered these sort of instruments for looking at fast and slow life history strategies. That'd be really interesting to see that.
Thanks.
Okay, other questions, please.
It's even more awkward on Zoom than it is in real life.
Of course it is. No, I mean, my issue is that I had a second question, but then Bogusz went and asked it. In fact, of course, in a much more thorough way than I possibly could. So.
Sorry. Hey, Ula. How are you?
Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a more general question, because as you presented, the whole field has went like upside down and there has been a lot of disagreement. Do you think that it's actually possible that we never reach an agreement as to what actually happens and what changes, what doesn't?
I think that's a very real possibility. So let me just check I've understood this right before I start shooting my mouth off. Do you mean there's a bunch of people, do you mean there's some people, researchers in the field, whose views on this one way or another are just so entrenched that they're not going to change their mind, whatever people find? No,
I think even more generally, is it possible that it's so complex and there are so many, like whatever new topic we seem to investigate, it just adds to the confusion. So you investigate one scale and then it turns out that the subscales change in a different way. So you investigate attractiveness and then you see all the different cues that tap into attractiveness. Yeah, I think that's very, 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 very possible.
I think it's one of the things that I think would, if you look at some other areas of, even in psychology, if you look at educational psychology, for example, the sophistication in their measurement development is streets ahead of what we do. We use these tools and these instruments. I think what we really need to be doing is pulling together to design instruments that are specific to exactly the questions that we're asking. And I think a lot more, if we did a lot more work on scale development, I think we'd be in a lot better place. And people like Jessica Flake at McGill, who are sort of specialized in this, or Eiko Fried in Leiden, would be just horrified if they looked at the approach that we have in the field to scale development and scale choices. And I've seen them talk about this, and I think actually in one of their papers they actually point to cyclic shift work as an example of where scale development could be really useful, and is just not, the people working in the field don't really recognize it. So I think that could go a long way to sort of improving and tightening up the field. And we're already seeing a bit more standardization and measurement of conception risk, for example. Your own work's a really good example of that. So I think we're sort of heading in the right direction. In terms of whether or not the issues are resolvable or not, I think a big problem for the literature, and I think it's actually a big problem in evolutionary, particularly the sort of psychology end of it in particular, is it's really hard for us to identify a smallest effect size of interest in the way that it is, the way that in some other areas of psychology, they're often quite easily able to. We don't really have any understanding of how big a cyclic change in any of these behaviors would need to be to have the effects on things like reproductive fitness that we are often assuming that they do. And I think if we had a bit more of an understanding of that, that would be a useful exercise in and of itself, to know whether the changes we're seeing are remotely able to drive the sort of to get the benefits that we think they might be, or we often think they might be. But it would also open up new statistical analytical techniques that would allow us to say, not just that we've got a null result, but that we've got evidence against a positive result. So it's a little, kind of overlaps with Bayesian testing, equivalence testing it's called. And I think that would do an awful lot to tidy up the area, because I think a lot of the time we're chasing down blind alleyways by following up false positives or worrying that we're missing something, because the effect's so small it might not be detectable. And I guess at some point we've got to say, if the effect's so small, it's really, 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 really hard to detect. Why do we care? And I think I'm starting to head in that direction myself.
So after many, many years of studying this, you can admit that maybe. Yeah.
I mean, I think Ruben Arslan, who's done a lot of work on the area, might have hit the nail on the head when he said that his mum had told him that one of the only things that changed over the menstrual cycle was sexual desire. And that looks like it could be right. Could have saved us all a lot of time if we just asked Ruben's mum.
Yeah. All right. Well,
further coffee on that bombshell.
Yes, I think unless we have Ruben's mom right here to answer some further questions, this might be the appropriate time to head off for coffee. So we have a half-hour break for coffee, and we meet back at 3 o'clock for the next session.
Thank you very much. Then. Yeah, thank you, and sorry for the technical problems at the start. Cheers.
Not a problem. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.